The poet Rumi says, "Sit, be still, and listen. For you are drunk, and we are at the edge of the roof." And welcome to the roof, by the way. What a great venue. So this is us. As a species, we are at the edge, and we're drunk on growth. Economic growth has delivered many good things, like rising life expectancies and a global reduction in poverty over the last 20 plus years. Small wonder, then, that we associate growth with gain. But the way we grow no longer serves us. We're focused on growing for growth's sake, and unless we step back and think, we could fall off the roof. So good morning. I'm Sarah Sieloff, and our future depends on our ability to reimagine growth. Welcome to the Sapiens Project, a new effort I'm proposing to build a movement around this existential challenge. First, some background. This is world population growth over the last 12,000 years. It has doubled since 1975 and increased eightfold since 1800. This is world GDP, gross domestic product, basically the size of the world economy, over the last 2,000 years. As we practice it now, economic growth requires the continued expansion of our consumption of energy and natural resources. This hockey stick-shaped graph is behind our current climate crisis. Things need to change, and intriguingly, they're about to, because for most of human history, economic growth has been intimately tied to population growth. But demographers predict that global population will peak by the 2060s. Now that's a problem, but it's also an opportunity. It's a problem because our economic system is predicated on more people buying more stuff. It's an opportunity because we know we need to decrease resource consumption in order to continue to survive on this planet. And if the number of people available to consume declines, that could be a positive thing for climate targets. But adjusting to these changes requires planning starting now. This is the shrinking Japanese city of Ito. It's an example of what's called a shutter town. Note that most of the shops are shuttered. So this is the kind of dislocation that comes from not planning for a shrinking population. Now, I find this intersection between demography, economy, and ecology fascinating. And in 2020 and part of 2021, I spent 15 months in Japan as a Council on Foreign Relations Hitachi Fellow. I was studying population aging and decline, one common sign of which are abandoned houses like these, known as akiya. And as an urban planner with a background in public policy, I wanted to know how Japanese cities are preparing for an older and smaller future. How were they thinking about shrinking? So here's some background. Japan hit peak people at 128 million in 2008. And since then, as you can see in red on the right, deaths have outnumbered births. Now immigration is limited, so for purposes of this analysis, it's out of the picture. And the Japanese government predicts that by 2065, Japan may lose 30% of its population. So how is Japan preparing for a smaller future? Government at all levels is urging people to have more kids. So that's right, rage against the machine, grow against the decline. And that was my aha moment. Shrinking cities are a symptom. The real issues are our beliefs and attitudes about growth. Why were so many Japanese leaders focused on population growth? Why weren't they planning for a smaller future? And in some places, perhaps even planning eventually to not exist. Now, psychologically, that is really hard, but the data about Japan's population decline is clear, and it's been that way for decades. What's happening now is not a surprise. So how do we change mindsets? How do we rethink growth? Because the need to rethink growth is urgent. Economic growth as we practice it now, as growth for growth's sake, accelerates the climate change that is already underway. And this threatens us and those who will come after us. Since the end of World War II, we've come to understand gross domestic product, or GDP growth, as the highest and greatest good. But GDP misses things, like the costs of climate change. We won't achieve a lower carbon future if we don't evolve our relationship with growth. And we're out of time. We need to start asking new questions, not someday, but now. And those questions need to start locally, because all politics is local. The people who negotiate international agreements and set national policy and priorities reflect the will and fears and concerns and values of American voters. And as long as we continue to demand growth at any cost, elected leaders will continue to deliver. And we will all lose. And that is a rough way to start your morning. So let's shift gears. We call ourselves Homo sapiens, wise man in Latin, and we flatter ourselves. But I believe we can live up to the potential in our name. And that's what I'm pitching today, the Sapiens Project. This is a project that asks tough and sometimes threatening questions about economic growth, what we believe about it, and how we value it. It elevates thought leadership and builds a community of practice, experimentation, and strategy. The Sapiens Project asks, for example, what we in the US can learn from places like Japan. Because while I did observe a big fixation on growth, I also saw some really interesting new models. These folks are in an organization called the Tech Lab in the shrinking town of Manazuru, which is focused on trying to make itself a good place to live regardless of its size. And it's doing that by using places like the Tech Lab to grow its sharing economy and facilitate population flow through temporary remote working arrangements. And Manazuru is measuring its success via the density of internal connections that are forged and quality of life, not population growth. And that's a subtle shift, but it's a significant one, and we could stand to learn from places like Manazuru. The Sapiens Project also elevates local examples. Children of the Setting Sun Institute is a think tank in Northwest Washington founded and run by members of the Lummi Nation. Their Salmon People project spotlights the centrality of critically endangered salmon to many West Coast tribes, and it asks what it means to be salmon people in a future that may not include salmon. Children of the Setting Sun is showing the world what we stand to lose as we continue to prioritize growth. The Sapiens Project is also about truth. We can't green our way out of growth. When I interviewed the Reverend Takafumi Kawakami, a Zen priest based in Kyoto, he pointed out that the problem with sustainable development is that development still connotes growth. And this, he argued, and I think he's right, gives us the false idea that we can achieve sustainability without having to give anything up. And that is a really important point. So in 1979, two psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, articulated prospect theory. And basically this says that humans weigh losses and gains differently, and losses hurt way worse than gains feel good. And an honest conversation about economic growth requires a conversation about loss. We don't like loss, which is why we need to stare straight at this cognitive blind spot and steady ourselves to make tough choices about what we value, why, and what those choices mean for the climate and for future generations. So I put these Japanese plum blossoms in here to remind us to all take a deep breath. We can create a space to have honest conversations about climate change, our collective future, and what it's going to take to get there. I envision the Sapiens Project as a not-for-profit organization, and through it, I'm proposing to produce articles, op-eds, and interviews with leading thinkers and doers, plus case studies featuring real-world examples of people and places who are considering and creating alternatives to growth as usual. The ultimate goal of this project is what I set out to do when I left for Japan in 2020, to create a toolkit featuring real applied materials to help local decision makers in the US and internationally advance this work. I want to build a network of communities that are focused on doing growth differently. And I haven't waited to start this. I've published articles in national and international venues, and I'm mostly done with a book proposal. But I can't go to scale alone. I'm seeking $250,000 to get this project off the ground, and if you or someone you know is interested in being part of this, I invite you to come along with me on this necessary, urgent, and high-stakes quest. $250,000 will launch the Sapiens Project by supporting research, network building, and developing a public relations and media strategy, and executing it. So I invite you to join me at the forefront of this overdue movement. Contribute your knowledge and experience to the foundational mix. Brand yourself and your firm as the leaders who were there when the great shift began. Because if we don't shift, the future of Homo sapiens is seriously in doubt. To conclude, both climate change and population decline suggest that we have to get smaller and smarter faster. We have enough resources to feed and house everyone. We don't need continued growth. What we need is to get real about growth now. And that's what the Sapiens Project is about. It's about learning from and sharing with others and taking strategic action. It's about articulating what a livable future is going to demand of us, locally and individually. You can't shrink without giving something up, and that's really hard for Homo sapiens to handle. But shrinking is both necessary and inevitable. We have so much to gain. The question is how we will get there. So join me, because things should start to get interesting right about now. And thanks to the Pacific Council and International Policy, and thanks to my mentor, Dr. Bill Smith.